Good morning, everyone. Bonjour, and welcome. Thank you for joining us in this final day of this content-rich Geneva Peace Marathon. I'm pleased to moderate this workshop, focusing on the presentation of the report titled Perceptions, Vulnerabilities, and Prevention, Violent Extremism Threat Assessment in Select Region of the Southern Libya borderlands and Northwestern Nigeria. The study we present today was conducted by two UNDP regional bureaus, covering the Arab states and Africa respectively. It was carried out in close collaboration with the Small Arms Survey during the challenging times of the COVID-19 peak. This report focused on the borderlands of 5 countries: Southern Libya, Western Sudan, Northern Chad, Northeastern Niger, and Northwestern Nigeria. The report acknowledged that rising violent extremism threatens peace, security, and hard-won development gains. It examined underlying drivers of violent extremism, looks at the tipping points that lead to recruitment, and shed lights on the phenomenon at a very localized level. It offers also some programmatic and policy avenues to address it. For this discussion, I'm very happy to introduce a great panel here of friends and colleagues. Aji Beres, Director of UNDP Representation Office in Geneva, Daniel De Torres, Director of Small Arms Survey, Nicolas Florquen, Head of Data and Analytical and Senior Researcher at Small Arms Survey, Ala Tartir, Senior Researcher Project Lead at Small Arms Survey, Nirina Kiplagat, Regional Peacebuilding Advisor at UNDP Regional Service Center for Africa, and last but not least, my colleague and friend Roselyne Akombe, Governance and Peacebuilding Team Leader at UNDP Regional Service Center for Africa. Before giving the floor, I would like to inform you that the session is video recorded, and because it will be posted on our website, but we will only be showing this part of the room, so your identities will not appear. And myself, I'm Giordano Segneri. I'm Governance and Peacebuilding Team Leader at UNDP Regional Hub in Amman. I have now the pleasure to hand over the microphone to Aji Beres, Director of UNDP Representation Office here in Geneva, for the opening remarks, followed by Daniel Del Torres, Director of Small Arms Survey, who also shared his thoughts with us. Aji, many thanks.
Thank you very much. So I'm taking the virtual invisible mic over, as you said. So thank you very much for joining us today. It's absolutely my pleasure to welcome you here. I've been attending parts of the Peace Week this week, and I think there's a newfound energy after a long time of restricted or somehow a little bit subdued meetings. So I think there have been a lot of very fruitful discussions, some more at a higher and strategic level that relates to the peace actions, and some zooming into some of the more specific areas, just like our session today that's looking at a segment per se. So I'm pleased to welcome you and to present for our teams our report on perceptions, vulnerabilities, and prevention, focusing on violent extremism threat assessment in selected regions, as my colleague was saying, in southern Libya, borderlands, and northwestern Nigeria. Violent extremism, as many of you in this room of course would know, is a multifaceted and very complex phenomenon that is not limited by national borders, not specific regions or ideologies or individuals. Violent extremism really remains one of the major threats, I believe, and challenges to our peace and security worldwide and development prospects at all levels. The expansion of the Islamic State operations into the borderlands in southern Libya, the tenfold increase in attacks in the Sahel region since 2007 really pose a major threat to human security and development and stability in the region. And I really want to emphasize this link to development, because when we talk about violent extremism, we really need to consider the root causes that in most of the cases go back to development issues that I'm sure my colleagues will cover. The international community raised this concern at the Berlin Conference on Libya on 20th January 2020, calling for bolder preventive engagements in addressing the re-emergence of violent extremism in the region. UNDP has been, with international development partners' support, essentially at the forefront of with the member states to address the issue of violent extremism through development and peace-building approaches. And I think we very much recognize the further research need, which is pivotal for the scaling up of conflict-sensitive approaches, evidence-based interventions, especially in such complex environments that we're talking about, to better guide this kind of cross-border preventive action that would increase social cohesion, sustain development, and ensure the pathways really forward to peace and prosperity. So therefore, we as UNDP wanted to look into this issue a little bit more and commissioned a study in partnership with the Small Arms Survey, which resulted in this report that will be presented today. This is part of our overall Preventing Violent Extremism reports, including the flagship follow-up to our Journey to Extremism study in 2022, which I hope you will all have a look at as well. It continues to expand on UNDP's evidence-based research on violent extremism. And the report itself we present and discuss today is grounded on the findings and the strategic directions of the Journey to Extremism study in 2017, builds on it, which contributed to refocus attention toward acute challenges of peripheral areas of the borderlands, often vulnerable to the direct and indirect spillover effect of violent extremism activities, with many areas such as the ones located in the Sahel. So this report seeks to provide further understanding of the violent extremism dynamics, and I think that's what we're after. We really need to understand the dynamics so that we can address it. Without that, we're not able to understand the risk factors in southern Libya border region, for example. It also zoomed into the communities affected by violent extremism by analyzing their exposure and risks in the surveyed border regions, and it offered grounds for policy and programmatic intervention. So there's a link to the follow-up actions with an emphasis on the need for a deep and sustained development and investments in development and other issues, programmatic interventions in addressing economic deprivation, ethnic contestations and discrimination, cross-border organized crime and other governance challenges as critical factors that can exacerbate violent extremism if left unaddressed. And my colleagues are much better placed to talk about the details of and the dynamism of that. So the challenges highlighted in the report are complex. We all know that development actors must continue their work in a coordinated manner at all levels, from national, regional and global levels, because we need to address the structural and the pull factors of transnational violent extremism and try to build resilient communities against violent extremism across the region in Chad, Libya, Niger, Nigeria and Sudan. For the past 6 years, our various bureaus in Africa and Arab states have been jointly supporting the member states and regional organizations as well to address the issue through development and peace-building approaches, which resulted in concrete outcomes at the regional, national and the local levels alike. Based on the lessons learned and the good practices that emerge from this kind of programmatic intervention and research, because it is an iterative process between research and programmatic interventions, with close consultations with our partners and with the actors on the ground, such as the African Union, the regional economic communities, civil society organizations, development partners, to continue to address violent extremisms in this region, which is really one of the main focus in our overall efforts on PV. So I'll stop here and I hand over to my good colleague to give you a little bit of a different perspective, from a specialized perspective, and then we're looking forward to the discussion with the panel. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Heidi. Thank you, Giordano. It's a real pleasure to be here. It's actually a very interesting date. If you look at the calendar, tomorrow is the 5th of November, which is the anniversary of an attempted attack by a religious violent extremist on the Houses of Parliament in London about 40 years ago or something like that. There's a good movie about it, watch it if you have a chance. It is a reminder that violent extremism is something that affects us all. It's something that all societies, all countries, all regions of the world are affected. If we needed a historical reminder, the way things are going these days. Now, the survey has for many years worked on conflict dynamics and small island issues in North Africa and the Sahel, particularly through our security assessment in North Africa project, and Alan Cartier is the head of the project, the lead of the project. So we were delighted when the UNDP called on us to bring our expertise, and particularly our technical expertise, to bear in this joint effort, this joint report. Joanna mentioned already that in addition to the inherent difficulties of doing this type of research on this topic in these regions, on top of that we had to contend with COVID, which made it a more interesting process. And interesting for me, seeing for afar, probably extremely painful for the colleagues who were involved in that. But the idea is at the end we came with a report that provides an extraordinary analytical depth and nuance based on 6,800 interviews with different people in 5-6 different countries. One of the takeaways, and you'll get the presentation in summary, but to me one of the takeaways is that there's no, when you look at violent extremism, there's no such thing as the Sahel. Each place is very different. The challenges that they face, the potential drivers of extremism, they are very different. This is a very important lesson for the international community. Very important lesson for all of us trying to work to prevent and combat violent extremism. We cannot just have a blanket approach and say, this will work everywhere. And I think if something comes out really strongly in this report, is how each different region faces its own very particular challenges. The methodology that we use for this report, which again facilitated getting this depth and this nuance and this granularity, is a methodology that can also be replicated in other areas. And as I'm saying, violent extremism is a threat that affects us all, wherever we are, wherever we live. So just in summary, and to allow the panel to continue, I just have to say I'm extremely proud of my colleagues at the survey for the work that they've done. I'm very grateful to the UNDP for this fantastic partnership. And just to remind everybody that the report is available online in Arabic, in English, and in French, and I really encourage you to download it and read it if you haven't done so. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Aj and Daniel, for setting the stage so nicely. You highlighted the complexity of transnational violent extremist threats and their impact on development, human security, human rights, and especially affecting the vulnerable communities. Thank you for also hinting at the imperative of whole of society approaches to building resilience against violent extremism. But now we will dive deeper into the analysis, and we are joined by the colleagues from UNDP and Small Arms Survey research team, who will present the findings and the recommendation of this very interesting and challenging journey. So we have Nicolas Florquen, Senior Researcher, Ala Tartir, Senior Research Project Lead, and Nirina Kiplagat, Regional Peacebuilding Advisor at UNDP. Dear teams, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Giordano, and thank you so much, Ali and Daniel, for the opening remarks, and thanks to all of you for being here today and for showing interest in this report. We are truly proud of this report that is available in 3 languages, as Daniel said. But really, I would like to start by thanking again all the partners that we worked with over the past 1.5 years. And also special thanks goes to the 6,852 people that we interviewed in 5 countries. In Sudan, in Libya, in Chad, Niger, and Nigeria. Without them, without their insights, without their original ideas, without the time and energy that they dedicated to us as researchers, we won't be here. So this is why I wanted to start with them, because this report, as you will see, it's really about their perceptions, it's about their values, it's about their beliefs when it comes to preventing violent extremism. And the second point is that it is really important that we're presenting this report today here at Geneva Peace Week, because the rationale behind this project and behind this report is a preventative one. How do we prevent violent extremism from happening? I just need my clicker there. Because the idea is we wanted to go to all these areas that we want to study in this report and find measures how do we prevent violent extremism in order not to create further problems. So we didn't go to the hot spots necessarily when it comes to violent extremism. We went one step back and looked at areas that could potentially become problematic or become an issue, and then we advised here in this executive summary that you can find outside how can we take some measures in order to prevent violent extremism from becoming even an issue or a bigger issue than now. So the rationale behind this report emerged because we see that there is an increase in violent extremism. And we know the link very well between that and development and developmental threats, and how it can affect the progress that we intend to do. And therefore, the UNDP and Small Arms Survey partnered with this project, produced this report, and we selected these 5 different regions to work on. So this is why it is a regional report. And we looked at these 5 different regions and areas because our research is embedded in the literature, in the sense that we know the literature tells us there is an issue there to be investigated. These areas share common similarities, common socioeconomic structures, similar issues, similar challenges. So there's that twist as well that we needed to address. And we also went further to the Nigeria side of the equation because we wanted to investigate other links that we see there when it comes to armed groups and weapons. And this is a little justification why we engaged in these 5 different countries and 5 different locations. What we wanted to achieve, we wanted to offer new data and new analysis, original insights that we gathered from the field. Through this bottom-up approach, we talked to the people, we heard them, and this is why we want to reflect in this report. We want to reflect these local needs, we want to reflect these local perceptions, and then we want to formulate them into policy recommendations. How we can take these voices and put it out there for the concerned stakeholders to formulate policy recommendations that matter to development, that matter to the people, and that matter to bringing peace a bit closer. And therefore, we also wanted to support these resilient communities, especially that they are located in the borderlands in these regions. So how we can support through the resilience, through programmatic interventions from the UNDP and other actors. And therefore, we wanted to understand and problematize these complex dynamics when it comes to the movement of people across the borders, to the movements of the arms, but also wanted to analyze the reach of these states. And are these state bodies strong, capable, able to provide these public services? What is the link between that and the turn into violent extremism, if that exists? And we wanted to bring these communities to the core of the analysis. And this is why we interviewed the 6,850 people between December 2020 and June 2021, and focused on 3 thematic areas. One relates to the violent extremism drivers, what drives violent extremism, and then the recruitment by these armed groups, and finally the affinity and affections towards violent extremist group and values. These are 3 analytical tools that we use in this report that we assessed through the questionnaire that I will describe in a minute. And through our research journey, and we discussed and we agreed that there are 7 drivers that we used for this report to analyze and to look at the violent extremism through them. One relates to hardships and poverty and the links between that and violent extremism. Another driver relates to the adequacy of security and injustice in these regions. Third driver relates to the limits or the limited access to public service, especially provided from state governments. And fourth driver relates to the identity issue, which was a bit challenging to tackle, but across these 5 different regions. But there was a clear identity element that we needed to tackle as a driver for violent extremism. And then we looked at 3 other drivers related to instability and security, and blocked political participation, and where are the people in the political system, in the political participation process. And finally, as a small arms survey, we had to put the illicit proliferation of small arms and check what story these arms tell us. So we looked at these 7 drivers and analyzed them, and we looked at the interviewees' knowledge when it comes to recruitment strategies in these violent extremist groups, and the attitudes towards them. So this is just visually where we conducted this research. Our local partners conducted this over these countries, over these regions, with all the participants, and we developed a questionnaire at the Small Arms Survey in collaboration with all our partners. That was, from a methodological point of view, the main process, that how do we develop this quantitative questionnaire, and how do we bring this randomized sampling approach? How do we go to the field and collect the data as the UNDP recruited and identified the local partners to work with? And this questionnaire, we made this questionnaire available in 4 different languages to be administered in the region and by during the field work. We conducted interviews with all the team. We conducted trainings with all these teams before going to the field. We followed the process very closely. And that's briefly on the methodology, how we developed this methodology and took it to the field. And our partners in Sudan, for example, the Badia Center for Integrated Developments, conducted this research in Darfur, where we piloted the project and the questionnaire at the beginning. In Nigeria, we collaborated with Professor Anthony Obey. In Niger, we collaborated with SERMEF. In Libya, with the North African Policy Initiative, and in Chad, with Bukafor. And we really thank them and their teams for dedicating all the time and energy to do all of that. And finally, the issues that, before here moving to Nicola to show us some of the findings, but these are the 5 main questions that we really wanted to tackle and to address through this question and through this study. How vulnerable are the surveyed border communities to violent extremism based on their exposure to main drivers of such extremism, like the one that I just described earlier? And what kind of comparisons we can draw between these 5 different regions, but also some similarities. And this is reflected in the policy recommendations and conclusions that we have. And also we wanted to understand what are the main potential drivers for recruitment by these violent extremist groups in these regions. And also, what about the perceptions about these people when it comes to these big names, big brand names for violent extremist groups? And if there are any links between these factors and the arms trafficking that is taking place in the region. And finally, we wanted to understand the policy implications and how we can input into the process of policy making through reflecting these voices. The report is detailed, comprehensive. With Nicola now, we'll give you some of the main highlights. But please, as Daniel said, we invite you to read the report, engage with us, send us your comments, your remarks, your feedback if you think we really need to take them for further actions and the follow-up. And with that, over to Nicola to take us through conclusions.
Thank you and good morning. I'm going to try to do it without the mic, but have a bit of a throat issue. So if you can't hear me, just tell me and I'll try to revert to the mic. Maybe before starting, I just wanted to highlight a couple of things to keep in mind. As the previous speakers have said, We didn't select violent extremism hotspots in this study. This was because these are areas seen as being at risk of potentially being affected by violent extremism. And so the methodology was to look at vulnerabilities, at perceptions of some of these issues and values that can be perceived as potentially problematic. And so the methodology was adapted to that, and so the study is a general population survey. We interviewed the population of these border areas, but not members of armed groups themselves, of violent extremist groups. And there's a subsequent study that UNDP is putting out in December that does that actually interviews members of armed groups. So our study is a bit different in that sense, but I think it's very complementary and actually provides a voice from those border communities that are affected in various ways by these trends. And so I hope that's very valuable to all of you. As my colleagues have said, the data is quite extensive, and it's also the first time we do this questionnaire. So the interpretation is based on what we're able to show in terms of differences or similarities between countries, but we don't have a baseline. This is the baseline, so for further interpretation we'll need to repeat this in other settings, in the same settings, and see how things evolve. But I think there's already some interesting trends to note here. The first slide here goes over some indicators for the 7 drivers of violent extremism. And what we try to do is see to what extent the different communities were similarly affected by these drivers, so their exposure to those 7 factors that Ala described, or if the situation was different. And so we created these spider charts, so you may be familiar with those when comparing sports athletes, football players, they will have often used to compare them, and the highest scores on these circles indicate higher exposure to the factors, and the lower scores, when it's closer to the center, it means below average responses on the 7 drivers. And so basically, if we had common perceptions amongst the 5 case studies, you would see basically 5 perfect circles right there in the middle line. Oops, I forget, this is right there on the middle line, the 0 line, which is the average for the entire data set. And so what you see here very clearly is, the exposure to these 7 drivers is highly inconsistent. As Daniel said, there's not one Sahel, there's very context-specific dynamics and levels of vulnerabilities and exposure to these drivers. So that's a key finding there. Just to give you a few examples, levels of hardship and deprivation, where we looked at issues about how people value their life, access to cash income. Those were particularly acute in Niger and Sudan, but less so in the other case studies. Discrimination and marginalization along identity lines, so religious, tribal, etc. This was felt much more strongly in Nigeria and Sudan. Disgruntlement with the government was perceived as very high in Libya, Nigeria, and Sudan. And what was interesting there was that did not necessarily coincide with the same levels of disgruntlement with the security forces. And so that shows that it's really important to clarify what people mean when they say they're disgruntled with the government or with the states, because government is not the same as security forces in their perceptions. We had the highest perceived levels of insecurity in Nigeria, which included very high rates of GBV, reported GBV. In northwestern Nigeria, 55% of the respondents there said their communities had been exposed to GBV-related violence over the past year, and that was clearly an outlier there. So also maybe on security, there was, for those who, there's a lot of people working on our groups in Geneva. We had an interesting finding that in areas where the security providers were a mix of national and local security providers, including non-state sometimes, people felt more secure. And that was quite an interesting tendency that needs to be unpacking, that probably meant different things in different contexts. But that's quite interesting that these sort of mixed security arrangements seem to coincide with higher perceptions of security. So again, the main takeaway here is not one Sahel, but very context-specific vulnerabilities. And so from a prevention perspective, you need to dig further into this and really understand the most acute needs, grievances at the context level in order to be able to take preventative measures. On the weapons, so we have a very nice visual here, although you probably can't read it too much, but this is, well, first on the arms issue in general, we also had very varied levels of concern over arms proliferation. Again, Nigeria stood out and Nigeria and Sudan, reported the highest levels of proliferation in the surveyed bordered regions. And one element that we want to show with this graph is that the flows of arms, as perceived by the communities, they're not just going one way. And so here on the left are the source countries for arms flows, and here are the destination countries. And it's quite interesting to see that all the case studies reported both inflows and outflows. And from an arms monitor perspective, what's also significant here is that the reported outflows of arms from Libya exceeded the inflows to Libya. And that's a bit of a shift from the situation since 2014, where we saw Libya being more of a magnet for weapons because of the deteriorating security there since 2014. But so at the time of the study, early 2021, clearly there was a perceived risk of resumed outflows of weapons from Libya. That coincides with other sources of information we have, and it seems to match other sources. So an interesting finding from an arms monitoring perspective. On the recruitment by armed groups, so we asked in 4 other countries whether respondents were aware about recruitment by armed groups in their communities. And we asked first about local and foreign armed groups, and 19% of the respondents were aware of such recruitment, which is, again, it's hard to interpret because we don't know how that stands in other regions, but in absolute terms, it's quite significant. 11% claimed to be aware of recruitment by violent extremist groups. However, in that question, we left it open how people interpreted what a violent extremist group is, and we found actually that they had quite wide-ranging interpretations. So that was a bit of a more problematic or hard to interpret data point there. What's interesting though is that the recruits that armed groups were recruiting in these regions were included both men and women. More men, but also women. So an interesting gender component there. And it was also interesting that the roles attributed to women within armed groups were quite different in the different contexts. For example, in Chad, we had a lot of respondents saying that women were also playing combatant roles, which wasn't the case in the other case studies. I'd also like to highlight, with respect to armed groups recruitment, the specific vulnerability of border trading communities. We found a strong correlation, and you see the graph here, between recruitment by armed groups and the extent to which cross-border trade was a source of livelihood for the families and communities. And so this really shows, how such communities that live from the cross-border trade are affected by the activities and exposed by the activities of the armed groups. It highlights complexities of these environments because the armed groups were, of course, often reported as having negative roles, as perpetrating attacks and the like, but they were also sometimes reported as having more positive roles, including providing protection, owning businesses, so creating jobs, and providing cash income. And so it's a very complex dynamic, in terms of trying to think of how to respond to that kind of situation, because a purely security-centric intervention that would try to go after these armed groups would also affect livelihoods and security in these communities. So an interesting finding there again. my last slide on the most challenging part of the study, which was to try to get a sense of the respondents' levels of affinity with violent extremist groups and values. And this was challenging because of definitional issues about what is a violent extremist group and what that might mean for people in these very remote communities. And so what we basically did is ask about, like, let's call them terrorist designated organizations, as agreed by the Security Council. And we just named, the mainstream armed groups, Al-Qaeda, Islamic State, etc., and asked about perceptions of those groups specifically, which most people know about. We also asked about a couple other indicators, and what we found was that about 30% of the respondents had not only extremely favorable views of the mainstream terrorist designated groups, but also held particularly strong grudges against like the system, like institutions, communities, organizations that are generally understood to provide good governance. And so this is a 3% that is an interesting subset, because as you see here with the first bar charts, they were also, that 3% was also more likely than the rest of the sample to support the killing of civilians under certain circumstances. So there was a link there to certain types of violence that are associated with violent extremism. Also, they were also extremely willing to die for a leader. So also, it's a 3% in the sample that we found is quite of concern from a violent extremism perspective. Again, what does that mean in the big picture? We don't have another baseline of what that figure might be in a different context. So it's both a small number, 3%, but it's potentially a big number if you apply it to the entire population of these regions. And I think it really makes the case that for prevention, that you have those views by a small part of the population, and if you want to prevent this from growing, you need to undertake preventative work. So I'll leave it at this, and Mirina will now go over to the easy task of telling us how to address all this.
Thank you very much. So picking up from Ala and Nicola, as mentioned, earlier this morning, really the reason for the research is to feed into policy and programming. So the next question is, what do we do with these findings? And so we have a set of policy recommendations, and these are based, as you will notice, on the drivers that have been identified, on the 7 drivers. So looking at the broad area, we combine 2 in terms of hardship, deprivation, and provision of services, really needing to look at the distribution of public expenditure. And has also been noted, in terms of the peripheral nature of border communities that are often marginalized. So the need to really look at increased coverage in terms of services for these marginalized border areas and really prioritize them. The second, broad area, the importance of having this preventative lens, what we sometimes refer to as prevention of violent extremism, relevant types of engagements. How do you integrate prevention of violent extremism into broader regional and development stabilization efforts from an early stage? So really to have this preventative approach embedded within other broader development or stabilization work. And just to link to that, to mention in terms of also a programmatic level, how do you ensure this is done? So in terms of the measurement, component, what key indicators do you need to have? Looking at also short, medium, and long-term types of approaches. When we talk about development planning, of course, we're looking at more longer-term types of engagement, stabilization, more short-term, but also in terms of the immediate. What kind of immediate steps need to be taken? In also a conflict-sensitive manner that does not, further marginalize, certain groups by stigmatizing them. So having this adequate, research and approach to have these gap filler, immediate approaches. having community-led engagement and dialogue to address social cohesion, what also has been found is really this issue of social contract in terms of also the gap between the community and how they're perceiving sort of local governance or security, and has been highlighted also the differences between that and the importance of highlighting who do we need to focus on in terms of promoting social cohesion, and I'd also say in terms of social contract. The third main area, since the first two are combined, is really looking at the issue of blocked political participation. So one of the first, and we see this also reflected in a number of other areas in terms of border communities, is the issue of citizenship and voting issues among women and men in border communities. The second, and this is often highlighted more and more, is the issue of hate speech and supporting free and responsible press or media initiatives in order to prevent and mitigate. So also looking at certain monitoring mechanisms, and this will link with one of the other recommendations, also looking at the element of narratives, but communication is definitely a key area of engagement. Facilitate and encourage participation in political debates. Although there are other, also gender-specific recommendations, really the issue of political participation of women is key. And as we note, as has been mentioned by Giordano, in terms of also these whole society approaches, we see this reflected in development of prevention of violent extremism strategies and action plans and their implementation. And so having an inclusive approach in terms of the development of these strategies and involving different stakeholders, including religious leaders among them. When we go to the next two, in terms of recruitment of armed groups, really prioritizing prevention of violent extremism interventions in these areas, particularly those that are dependent on cross-border trade. As you've noticed, these are some of the vulnerable areas. Encouraging and promoting borderland trade initiatives, ensuring legitimate cross-border trade while preventing them from being exploited by these violent extremist groups. So really building the resilience within these communities and also cutting off or disrupting more of these supply lines that then foster and support these violent extremist groups. As I mentioned, the component in terms of communications, media, narratives remains very key. And as we see from the findings, also some of these positive perceptions of the violent extremist groups, the importance of having not only counter-narratives to the specific messages, but also promoting an alternative narrative. And this we have found particularly effective, not only in online spaces, but also in offline spaces. And this leads to also the elements of community cohesion and trying to promote that through more sort of positive alternative narratives within specific areas. The importance of more research, and this is something that is very key as we also notice not only the differences between these areas, but this is also a very dynamic issue. So the importance of having ongoing analysis, very locally based, to continue to inform approaches and ensure that they really are meeting the vulnerability factors. We've also seen the importance of control in terms of proliferation of small arms and light weapons, and has been noted, we've also seen a difference in terms of the flows over the last few years. So really having context-specific and conflict-sensitive responses to arms proliferation to limit the access of violent extremist groups to them. Having these rapid assessments, as mentioned, also to note where are these differences, and also in terms of interruption of these flows. Designing and supporting initiatives that mitigate the risks to communities, so this can also include more awareness raising and engagement within the communities, for example, and also reporting, and supporting efforts to hamper violent extremist armed groups' access to small arms. And this is in line with the UN Security Council resolutions of 1970, 1970 of 2011, establishing the arms embargo of Libya. So these are some of the select recommendations for the policy level, which will feed into practice. And to conclude, we have 4 key conclusions. Really, the first is the susceptibility to recruitment in violent extremism should be a cause of concern. As mentioned, this is a perception, survey, and having noted, the findings, there is the potential for deterioration, and spread, and this is why we really do try to invest in prevention. The second is the issue of identity, which has really been highlighted, be it ethnic, tribal, or religious, and the importance of this, and also noting the widening gap between groups. And we also find, in research that we have done, which is also complementary, that the risk factors of when someone is isolated and sort of taking in messaging very limited types of contacts with other groups, and we see this when there are these sorts of divisions between identity groups. So the need for more social cohesion, promotion. The third is really employing a people-centered approach to security and justice. And this is very important, again, when we look at lessons learned, for example, from other regions, where some of these heavy-handed security approaches have had a negative effect and actually further, divided the communities from government and really has acted as a driver towards violent extremist groups. And as already mentioned, some of these VE groups have played particular roles which are similar to government within local communities. So the need to have this people-centered approach. And the last one is also achieving security, but not at the cost of livelihoods. And again, linking more of this holistic, approach that balances the needs to improve security without disrupting livelihood sources. And as also we have seen in complementary research, that the economic drivers really remain one of the main ones in terms of voluntary recruits. So I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nicholas, Ala, and Irina. The findings illustrate that we have a lot of work to do in terms of addressing socioeconomic hardship, grievances, situational factors, and better targeted interventions. Is critical also to further socialize this recommendation to make sure they feed into programs, policies, and strategies in the field. We'd like to give now the audience the opportunity to ask questions to our panelists or share any reflection on the report that has been just presented. So happy to take a couple of rounds of questions from you.
Yes, I would like to know from the researchers, the questions were all very on the negative, or focusing obviously on the vulnerability to violent extremism. And I was wondering, would it make sense, or have you considered also to include questions like on the opposite, like why certain communities or people are not vulnerable to it, or why communities are more resilient than others, and like basically the counter drivers, the drivers for resilience, stability, and peace, and how can we bring these together? Why did you decide in the research to only focus on the drivers for instability, so to say, and not equally also on the drivers for stability?
Thank you. Any other question? Or reflection?
Yeah, I have a question on with regards to the analysis of the social cohesion. I was wondering if you focus mainly on the gap between perception of like the ethnic gap, or if you also focus, for instance, on social cohesion, the role of social cohesion in coping with like economic coping or for livelihood schemes.
Yes.
Hello, my name is Lydia Stone. I'm from the UK Foreign Office. We run a research programme called the ACCEPT programme, which is the Cross-Border Conflict Evidence Policy and Trends programme. I was really interested in your fourth finding about the problem with securitising borders and the impact that has on livelihoods, which is a finding that's really coming out of the research on our programme as well. A couple of questions I have are, did you consider the role of extractive resources in communities and whether that is having an impact on violent extremism and the potential to turn to violent extremism. Also, the role of trauma in communities as well, and whether communities that are and individuals that have suffered from trauma are more likely to be drawn towards violent extremism. And thirdly, if I may, we all want our research to be to influence policy and practice. It's really nice that UNDP was part of this. Do we know if this is going to be taken up by UNDP in any programming?
Yes.
I just want to know, because currently the youth are very important, very implicated in Africa, and we haven't seen any reference toward the young communities and young people that are a big portion of the population. I just want to know if there is a special reason about it.
Thank you. Maybe we stop here for the first round. Then to our panelists, Nicolas, and Mirina.
Thank you. I mean, for the first question on the framing of the questions, they're actually quite neutrally framed. I think it's the way we present the data, because we're thinking about preventing extremism, that we focus on vulnerabilities rather than resilience. But you could actually present all that data the other way around and say, we have a 3% that the respondents that we're concerned about, but there's 97% that did not share those views. So I think it's actually very useful that you put this out, because I think the questions would allow us to do what you just said, because a lot of the survey by design has to be, it should not introduce bias in the way that it's framed. So we pay a lot of attention on how we ask the questions. So yeah, it's a very good point. So we'll try to think about it when we do the next round of communications around it. I can maybe take the ones on extractive industries. I don't think we looked at it in detail. However, we're well aware of the issue of mining, gold, artisanal mining in some of these areas, and some of the linkages throughout the research, how armed groups have adopted a predatory, predatory, aggressive behavior with those mining sites and trying to seize income and control of some of these sites. So it's not something we looked at in depth, but surely it's something we're following as well. On the role of trauma, so yes, we did, we asked some questions more from a victimization perspective. So, was your community attacked? Were members of your family attacked? And this is framed as, some of the indicators when we look at indicators of insecurity in the communities. Now, to do some kind of analysis of how that influenced, or was there a relation between those and the perceptions, the violent extremism indicators, the issue there was that the numbers were quite small, I think, and it was, I don't think the sample size allowed for anything in terms of that, but we certainly had some pretty good measures, some interesting measures, I think, in terms of at least victimization and experiences of violence. So there's, maybe it's something we can follow up with you also. On the issue of youth, we actually had a few questions about this. What was interesting was that young respondents, both men and women, reported higher rates of discrimination, along the identity lines that were presented, than the older generation. So there was particularly high feelings of discrimination among youth segments. We also asked questions about the representation of women and youth in leadership, in community, and political roles, and we saw some big differences. For example, women and youth were felt to be highly underrepresented in Sudan and Nigeria. So there's some indicators that look at this.
Thank you. My name is Margot. I'm a researcher at the Center on Conflict and Peace at the Graduate Institute. Thank you so much for presenting the study and well done on carrying it out in the circumstances. I have two small questions. The first is I have worked more until now non-state-owned groups, rebel groups. So I'm wondering, and of course there's a big literature on the drivers and the reasons for recruitment into armed groups and affinity towards them. So I'm wondering if you have identified just some kind of connections or differences in those aspects related to violent extremist groups. Are there specific things that differ when we look at drivers in terms of recruitment between violent extremist groups and more maybe rebel groups? And then the other one, I guess, is it's not really a question. I mean, it follows a little bit from what will happen now that the study has been conducted. I think the fact that you've done such a big survey with populations, you also have maybe on the population side an expectation of getting something in return. So yeah, it's more a question of how do you give back in a sense? Are you going to present the study, for example, in those different areas that you have engaged, or yeah, just real kind of dissemination strategy?
Thank you. We take two other questions. Three other questions.
At that table.
1, 2, 3. Yes, please.
Thank you for presenting the findings of the report and for the panelists. My question is regarding women recruitment. They mentioned correlation between underrepresentation in systems and prevention of violent extremism. I was wondering if you found the link between violent extremism and education, especially, and how do you see we can include a gender perspective when it comes to post-conflict processes from a policy perspective?
Thank you.
Thank you. I think it would be great to hear more of a reflection on how much this is good news, that means resilience, how much this is bad news, meaning vulnerabilities, and what is in fact the threshold for us to decide or that would justify starting with a specific programming from a perspective of prevention of violent extremism, or whether it should be development programming broadly.
Take the last question for this
Thank
round.
you. Imelda Mohammed, I'm a former member of parliament in Tunisia, and actually I participate in the legislation on preventing extreme radicalism in Tunisia, and we keep focusing actually in the security approach. And even if in the national strategy we focus also in a theoretical level, let's say in the prevention, so the education, the cultural prevention, but the implementation of the national strategy focus a lot in the security approach. But so my question is, do you analyze the different implementation of the national strategies of this country, and in terms of cooperation also between the border control and the military control, let's say, and cooperation between the different countries for the flows for the foreign fighters, and how to prevent actually the radicalism in those countries when it comes from let's say foreign fighters, not from the local communities. Maybe the case of Libya is the most evident one, because there is this we keep hearing actually from the Libyan that the majority of the main causes of the radicalization in Libya, it comes not from the local communities, but it's affected from the foreign fighters, especially from the border countries. So do you analyze this part also? Thank you.
Very challenging questions, very good ones. Who wants to start? Nerina, Nicolas?
Well, quickly, I wanted to comment on two questions, maybe starting with Iman's last question on the national strategies, and if we looked at them and the way they were implemented. What we were more interested in knowing the trickle-down effect of these strategies, in the sense, how do people feel? So, and in many of these, or almost all these locations, the state is not particularly present through public services and goods. So maybe they are present through the securitized approaches. So maybe the people see the security forces of the state. Maybe they live through the repression and oppression, and that is reflected on the way how they feel. So it's not that we took the national policy and looked at the implementation of it. We were more interested in the people and how they were interacted with these policies. This is why, through everyday life, this is why we focused more on the perceptions rather than the policy itself. But also on the question of education. That's a very important question, and also in the analysis it comes up quite strongly through engaging with these different avenues for education, be it Quranic school, being at conventional school, be it online, as a way to change the mindset and as a way to bring more tolerance within the community, especially when we bring the identity issue to the complexity of this discussion. So education, counter-messaging came up very clearly as a way to move to the positive side, to change these from being threats into more of opportunities. I will think more about this threshold, about when it is bad news, when it is good news, because there are obviously many elements of good news, but many elements of bad news. I don't know from an analytical point of view how easy it will be to have a threshold to know, to make the judgment there. But what the results are made very clear is that a holistic developmental approach is really the way to go in order to address the root causes of these issues, and not through technical, securitized approaches and interventions that could bring some short-term effects, positive effects, and fill some short-term gaps. But if we think of long-term, if we think about root causes, it's really this bigger, holistic developmental approaches that will make a difference. But I leave it here for the time. Marina?
Yes, thank you. So the first one on the narratives. I mean, what we have found is really from implementation, work, and then also, some research. So while we still do counter-narratives, and these are, as we know, more responsive and reactive to specific narratives being shared by violent extremist groups. But we've also found in terms of recruitment strategies that they are very tailor-made, they're very personalized, and it's very challenging to address these when you're being reactive and having more of this general counter-narrative approach. So in a lot of the work on prevention, we also focus particularly on the alternative, narrative. And this is more, very much on a local level, promoting, for example, local heroes, promoting social cohesion. So they are quite, complementary. So that is, the reason we have a mix of both. So a lot of the community resilience type of work has a strong alternative narratives, component to it. In terms of engagement with the communities, for whom we have done, the research, there are, in terms of, research and findings and rolling out engagement strategies, we do this at multiple, levels, and indeed, for different audiences. And just to mention that our Libya country office has already had, a national, level event. And as mentioned, this does feed into work, that we're doing. So there is this connection and ongoing engagement within the target countries. I won't speak to education, since you've mentioned that, but that is really, key. And even when we look at, vulnerability factors of individuals, we do find that, the number of years of education does play a factor in terms of the vulnerability. The development programming, versus PVE programming, what I would say is the importance of having the PVE approach within the development programming because of elements such as targeting. Seeing, where are the specific risk factors, what are the drivers, where are the geographic areas of focus, who are, the at-risk groups. So, yes, the importance for this to be, reflected, but still having more of this, PVE research, I would say, feeding into the work. Indeed, in terms of this, specific research, the component of the national strategies, was explained. But just to complement that, in terms of the work that we do support also monitoring of implementation of national action plans or subnational action plans. So that is a component that's there, and also in some of the work that we're doing programmatically, indeed the element of foreign fighters does come in some countries. Indeed, it varies according to context. But for example, in Sudan, that's also is a factor in terms of also monitoring. But it does look at it in quite robust way, generally speaking, in terms of how this feeds into the work.
Yeah, maybe just a couple points on masculinity and gender. So I think overall, we were surprised to find more differences between men and women's perceptions, but we did find quite a few interesting points. I mentioned the whole issue around marriage, the difficulty to marry, which applied to both men and women actually, and how that's that has implications from masculinity perspective, and expectations for the man to be a provider and all these things. So clearly that's a vulnerability for men in these regions not being able to fulfill expectations and trying to move abroad, or they might be vulnerable to some of the recruitment strategies of the violent extremist groups. We had some differences. I mean, for example, female respondents were a bit more likely, to report not receiving cash incomes. It was something like 61 for women, 55% for men who said that they had no cash income over the past year, at some point over the past year. So some differences, but not huge. What else can I tell you on this? Interestingly, on the affinity to violent extremism, so that 3% indicator that we developed, usually men had higher levels of adherence to these values that I described, except in Nigeria, where women actually had higher scores. So, again, context specific. On maybe just a couple words on recruitment strategies. So we had some complementary, more qualitative work in Libya. So the recruitment strategies that came out as the most important ones were offering economic advantages, and so that really goes with the whole hardship indicators that we looked into. Otherwise, the use of close friends or personal networks, so that's how people were getting recruited, and actually the use of the internet was also mentioned. And we saw that social media penetration was actually there in all the case studies, so that was quite interesting. Other strategies that were cited were tribal links, influential leaders, the prospect of marriage, again, adventure, coercion, and abduction. So that's just some examples. There's more in the reports, but some food for thought there.
Thank you very much to all of you and to the panelists for the really rich interaction. So as UNDP, with other UN organizations and partners, national, regional partners in particular, we continue to operate to address these challenges. And as panelists have said, as Nirina, you aligned, technical assistance, sharing best practices at the national, subnational, regional level through platform, and also working in the field and at community level are some of the ways that we use to address prevention of violent extremism in the context. And now it's time for the closing. We are a little bit out of time, and I would really invite Rose to come and share some final thoughts with us. Thank you very much. Thanks a lot, everyone, for your patience and contribution. Rose, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I think our moderator needs a big round of applause, no? Thank you very much, Giordano, and thank you so much, colleagues, for the very interesting points that you've all made. Irina, Nicola, and Ala. I didn't want to say Alan. Ala. So thank you so much again, and we really appreciate the work that the Small Arms Survey has been doing with us, and in a very difficult environment, so we deeply appreciate. And to all of you, the participants, we appreciate all the good points that you made, all the questions. Some of them made me feel like I was back in grad school in a nice way. So we want to really thank you for taking your time to be here with us, but for also questioning some of the work we're doing and how we're doing it, which only makes us try and be better next time in how we do our work. So we just want to really appreciate you for taking the time to be here with us. You know, when you're asked to give closing remarks when people have been having an interesting conversation, it feels like you're the one who's coming to end something that is very nice. But maybe let me highlight a few things that I was hearing around us as we speak, as we close. I think the first, and I keep saying, if you forget anything else, I think you should remember some of this. I think the first of those is that the development challenges have a big role in contributing to vulnerability. Not just only the development challenges, but also issues of governance. I think at the core of it were areas around governance and areas around how the state, the failure of the state in certain places, whether it's a state failing to deliver public services or the state unable to address its border concerns, leads really to vulnerabilities or becomes part of the drivers. So the 7 drivers of violent extremism is really important to keep that in mind. I think the second one for us and for all development actors is that then for us to be able to address those 7 drivers, we have to focus on sustainable efforts. And this is something that is more long-term. It's not, like something that we can just do a magic wand. And as Member of Parliament, you know very well that these are not things that you can just say, we will just have this magic wand today and we'll resolve it. But it's about the sustainability and efforts that we are doing as UNDP, as development actors, to try and address these issues in a more sustainable way so that you're dealing with exclusion, you're dealing with identity issues, but also the drivers of violent extremism. I think linked to that is really a point that we saw from some of our other work that we're doing with other development actors, and I think Nerina mentioned about the drop we are seeing in investment in prevention. Not just prevention of violent extremism, but prevention in general. And yet we know from evidence that for each dollar you invest in prevention, for each dollar you invest in peace building, you are saving about $16 in effects that we see on development. So there is data, growing data, that shows that investment in prevention, investment in peace building does lead to savings overall in terms of the losses we get, $16 at least. So I mean, if I'm thinking as an economist, I would invest the $1 so that I can save $16. But it's still difficult. It's still a challenge for us to be able to get people to invest. I think it's easier to buy the flashy machine guns and all the arms that are related to secularization of prevention of violent extremism than investing in things that we know work. But it's an advocacy thing that we hope that as you work on this, that you can raise and show that prevention does work, and investing in a developmental approach to prevention of violent extremism has an impact. I think you heard very clearly from, I think, Marina's response that we're not just doing research. I know that the Small Arms Survey have the pleasure of being able to just work on the survey, do their research and show their data and say, look, this is what we've done. But we have an additional challenge as development actors, that in addition to enjoying the surveys and the results, we have to do something about it. And so you heard what both, I think, Giordano and Norina mentioned, that we're doing something about it. We're not just doing the research, we're not just collecting the data, but we're also doing something about it through our programmatic interventions, through what we call on the African side, the governance and peace building framework that has 6 pillars that is using this data to address some of those things. So there is something we're trying to do in terms of violent extremism. I really like the brilliant questions around the room on the youth. Where are we? Where are those voices? Especially when you're thinking about the African continent, where 60% of our population is young people. I mean, when you think about South Sudan, 73.6% of the population is people who are below 30 years old. How can you not include them? And so, how can you not center them? So really, very, very interesting points from all of you, and I want to thank you for that.